Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Today, we will be discussing one of the most mysterious actresses from the golden age of Hollywood, Jean Arthur. This episode is dedicated to my friend Jim. Thanks for the request, pal. Gladys Georgiana Green, known by us as the future Jean Arthur, was born on October 17, 1900, to parents Hubert and Hannah Green in Plattsburgh, New York. The family, which consisted of the parents, 3 sons aged 10, 8, and 6, and a bunch of dogs prior to Gladys joining the family, had just relocated from the Wild West. Hubert sounded like a very colorful man. He was described as, quote, charismatic, happy-go-lucky, and a bit of a showman, a humorist and optimist, end quote. He was an alcoholic cowboy who loved dogs and loved painting. It sounds like he just loved life. Hannah was described as serious and strong-willed. Her daughter, Jean Arthur, would later describe her, quote, like a Viking princess when she got mad. The family lived in Plattsburgh, New York for the first 5 years of Gladys's life. Plattsburgh is located at the tippy top of New York, with Canada bordering its north and Vermont bordering its east and the beautiful Lake Champlain in its front yard. Hubert worked at the George T. Woodward Studio, which provided photography services, frames, engravings, and art goods. He made just about enough to support his family. Gladys was quite a bit younger than her older brothers, and she was the only girl of the 4 children. So her childhood was pretty lonely. As we hear in so many of our stories, she had to tap into her creative and imaginative mind in order to entertain herself. She had a large family of dolls, and she would create colorful worlds for them to live in, worlds that she dreamed of living in herself one day. As she grew out of her love of dolls. She envied her brothers and the adventures they were always keeping themselves busy with. She wanted that kind of excitement and thrill. So she transitioned from the little girl who made sure her dolls were always exquisitely dressed to the rough and tumble girl of adventure. She later said, quote, I felt cheated, frustrated. I became a tomboy in self-defense. I decided I was going to do things that were exciting or at least interesting, end quote. Her loneliness was also due to the family's constant moving around. They would bounce around between New England and Florida, and Gladys would be plopped down into a school wherever they happened to be. She said later as an adult, quote, I've never had a single close, intimate girlfriend in all my life. I never had a chum to whom I could confide my secrets. I suppose that accounts for the fact that now it is so painfully difficult for me to open my heart and confide in people who are, so often, almost strangers. You have to learn so very young how to open your heart, end quote. Now that she's become a self-proclaimed tomboy, she hasn't lost that imaginative spirit. She was just able to express it in more ways now. She was described by some family members as eccentric. Her mother constantly told her to start acting like a lady. She was described as different from her family. A cousin said she was born to be an actress. Again, her uniqueness would shine like a diamond in today's world, but she was just a weird little girl in her day. Although she was shy around strangers, which pretty much everyone outside her immediate family would always be, she would put on performances at home or at her grandparents' home. Her family hated it, but she did it anyways. According to her grandparents, Hollywood was a place, quote, naughty girls went. There was one person who never thought poorly of her father. She was always Daddy's little girl. He was eccentric just like her, and they were 2 peas in a pod. She could always count on her dad to support her unique personality. After that lovely description of young Gladys, aka Jean Arthur, and her father, I think you can see where I'm heading next. I'm about to burst that happy little bubble for all of us. Gladys's only friend and the only person she thought would ever understand her, her father, walked out on his family in 1909 when Gladys was only 8 years old. She was left empty and alone. Hubert and Hannah had always been polar opposites, and they had little room to budge in embracing their differences. Hubert was a free spirit who loved to be drunk as many hours per day as he could, and Hannah was a strict, religious, and straight-laced woman. There is a little light to this dark story, though. Hubert would pop back in from time to time, so he didn't just walk out the door never to be seen again. But that doesn't mean it wasn't an extremely traumatic situation for Gladys. She felt abandoned. She felt like she wasn't the most important thing in her father's life, and he was the only important thing in her life. Gladys was sent to live with her grandparents in a different town in 8th grade. Another new school, another set of new strangers. A couple of years later, in 1915, when Gladys was 15 years old, the on-again, off-again marriage of her parents became on-again. Gladys was welcomed back into the family, and the three of them relocated to New York City. Her brothers were all grown men by now. Gladys loved New York City. The arts, the entertainment, the bohemian lifestyle of Greenwich Village. It was all so exciting. And just down the street from the family's apartment was the Audubon Theater, where Gladys could see movies for 10 cents. And she saw as many of them as she could. This was her escape. And this is where her dreams could flourish. Gladys dreamed of big things for herself. She wanted a career. She wasn't quite sure what that career would be yet at the age of 15, but she was going to be someone, and she was going to make a difference somehow. She is quoted as saying, quote, "I knew that I would never have become just a wife. My imagination would have seen to that. I would have felt stifled with only housework to do." End quote. You go, girl. Gladys was happy in New York City, and her days of loneliness in all of the other towns of her childhood were whisked away by the bright lights and the energy of the city. She was finally in one school for more than a year. Maybe she could finally make and keep friendships. But not so fast. Hubert took off again, and Gladys was forced to drop out of school her junior year and go to work to help support herself and her mother. She would never return to high school. This would prove to be a difficult time for Gladys and her mother. They were struggling financially, Gladys's dreams of college were torn away, her future was looking grim, and then they lost one of her brothers in World War I. It was a devastating blow for the entire family. When Gladys was 18 years old, her determination had returned. She was going to make her life matter. She joined other women in the women's suffrage movement and cut her brunette hair into a short bob, a symbol of independence. And then the young beauty started working as a model. By 1920, modeling was a career for 20-year-old Gladys Green. She began by modeling clothing for catalogs and was quickly modeling for famous photographers and illustrators. And she was earning $5 per sitting with 5 or 6 sittings per day. So, adjusted for inflation, she was earning as much as $470 per day. By 1923, 22-year-old Gladys was selected to do a screen test with Fox Films. She was painfully shy, but her beauty was enough to land her a 1-year contract with Fox. Gladys and her mother were quickly on a train bound west to Hollywood. Remember, this is where her grandma said all the naughty girls go. Gladys was eager to prove her wrong. Now, what is the very first thing studios do to their fresh-off-the-train budding starlets? Rename them, of course. Goodbye, Gladys Green. Hello, Jean Arthur. Fox was eager to reveal their new discovery to the world. She was quickly appearing on entertainment magazines and was dubbed, quote, one of the most beautiful leading women in motion pictures, whose charm and histrionic ability will win her thousands of new admirers, end quote. Histrionic seems like a stretch of a description for a shy woman like her, in my opinion. Her film debut was the silent comedy short called Somebody Lied. Her major feature debut came shortly after in Cameo Kirby with John Gilbert and directed by John Ford. And then came her first female lead role in The Temple of Venus, and this was the perfect lead role for her to showcase her sweet and sexy screen presence. There wasn't much substance to the movie, more of a stand there and look pretty vibe, but it made people notice her. Her next film wouldn't go so smoothly, though. The director was getting frustrated with her lack of natural acting ability. He tried take after take, but he had had enough. He fired her from the role and had the studio send over a new actress. Jean later described the experience like this, quote, "There wasn't a spark from within. I was acting like a mechanical doll personality. I thought I was disgraced for life. I wanted to throw myself off a cliff," end quote. She wanted to leave Hollywood as fast as possible and return to New York, but she had signed a 1-year contract with Fox Films, so she was stuck. She'd have to face her fears and work on her weaknesses. So she did. She appeared in a string of comedy shorts. The biography I read described her early leading men as orangutans, lions, and dogs. I read that as a description of the types of men she was working with. Nope, they meant actual orangutans, lions, and dogs. One monkey almost bit her finger completely off during filming, and she forever bore the scar to prove it. Jean Arthur dutifully finished up her 1-year contract with Fox Films. And in that time, except for the times wild animals were attacking her, she realized she did really like acting. She wasn't very good at it, not yet, but she loved the creative outlet it provided her, and she was willing to put the work into bettering her skills. Now out of her contract, she did some freelance acting jobs. In 1924, 23-year-old Jean landed on the doorstep of Action Pictures, which made mostly B-westerns, and they turned them out fast. Director Richard Thorpe liked what he saw in the shy beauty, and he instantly had her in film after film. Jean Arthur starred in 20 low-budget westerns in a 2-year period, making about $25 per film. That would be about $445 per film today. These movies were a far cry from the big box office hits the huge stars were turning out, but they were providing a paycheck and giving her the experience that she needed. But eventually, she was ready for more.
Have you ever wanted to travel to the past and follow the trails of crooks, killers, and outlaws from yesteryear, all from the safety of a time machine? Well, on the Vintage Villains podcast, I examine the people, the cases, and the zeitgeist of the year in question so we can learn what made folks tick back then and better understand that which plagues us in the overwhelming present. Subscribe to Vintage Villains now on your favorite music or podcatcher apps, and I'll be seeing you soon in another century.
Things started looking up in Jean's career in 1927 when she was chosen for the female lead in the comedy The Poor Nut, opposite Jack Mulhall. Film critics didn't necessarily react kindly to her performance, but she did at least receive the exposure she needed. She hoped this would be the launching point for bigger and better roles. But the rejections just kept coming for the roles that she wanted. And this is when the already reserved Gladys Green became the made-up Jean Arthur inside a hardened shell. The shell that hid her true self deep, deep inside and buried her emotions as far within as she possibly could. Just a year after what she thought was her big break, only to be followed by several rejections, she told an interviewer in 1928, quote, "I've had to learn to be a different person since I've been out here. Anybody that sticks it out in Hollywood for 4 years is bound to change in self-defense. Oh, I'm hard-boiled now. I don't expect anything. But it took me a long time to get over hoping and believing people's promises." End quote. She had lost that little girl who would dream of vibrant worlds. She felt betrayed by those dreams. But then, not long after that interview, her chance at a big break came again. The movie was called Warming Up, and it was a box office success. And so was Jean Arthur. With the success of the film, Jean was offered a 3-year contract with Paramount Pictures and a weekly paycheck of $150. That's $2,700 per week today, and she was thrilled. Her father was thrilled too. When he heard about this big paycheck, he scurried right on out to Hollywood and moved in with Jean and her mother. Hubert and Hannah were on again. Paramount Pictures was the largest and most successful film studio during this time of the late 1920s. And it was the exciting time when silent films were transitioning into the magical world of talkies. Jean was terrified that her, quote, foghorn voice would ruin the career that she just finally got off the ground. But she was wrong. Her unique voice was just what they wanted. Now that we have Jean Arthur settled into her new comfortable life at Paramount Pictures, let's jump into her love life. Guess who had a huge crush on her? David O. Selznick. He chased her for a bit, he got into at least one fist fight over her, and then he finally got her. He was attracted to her unique personality. He loved that she was a little on the eccentric side and wasn't like the crowds of other women in Hollywood. She liked his energy, his drive, and his intelligence. She loved listening to his ideas. And he had some good ones. It was a good match of two creative-minded individuals. But, oops, David O. Selznick was already in a romantic relationship. And his girlfriend was Louis B. Mayer's daughter, Irene. He wanted to keep them both, but he had to choose. Meanwhile, Jean was not going to wait around. She began dating songwriter and pianist Oscar Levant. She felt an even stronger intellectual bond to Levant. The two would party the night away in speakeasies and have long, deep discussions about the things that mattered to them. She later referred to Oscar Levant as, quote, the only brain in Hollywood. But Jean and Oscar's love wasn't meant to be, and David Selznick was still not ready to give up Irene Mayer. Quickly approaching 30, ancient, Jean panicked a bit and quickly married the next man who came along. She still didn't want to be a housewife, but she did want somebody to share her life with. 28-year-old Jean Arthur said I do when she eloped with photographer Julian Anker in late 1928. Although she described him as having an Abraham Lincoln look to him, his personality sounds an awful lot like her father. Well, it turns out they should have slept on the idea of marriage because they had it annulled one day later. And then Julian tragically died shortly after when he suffered extreme sunstroke while out fishing. Now that Jean Arthur was making a name for herself as an actress, people wanted to know more about her. But that shell she had on her was strong, and she was hiding deep inside it. She refused to discuss her personal life with anyone. One publication wrote, quote, Jean Arthur probably leads a more secluded life than any other girl in pictures. With her father and mother, she lives in a roomy California bungalow. She seldom goes to public places, but keeps with a small group of friends. Horseback riding is her favorite outdoor sport, but she is an omnivorous reader, and her collection of books is notable for such a young person. Noise, confusion, glitter, and crowds are her aversions. Peace, quiet, good books, music, and congenial friends are her delight. End quote. Same, Jean Arthur. This would be a good time to mention that once Jean Arthur started to gain a little notoriety in Hollywood, she shaved a few years off her age. So when this columnist is talking about her young age, the world thinks she is in her early 20s when she is really almost 30. Networking is huge in Hollywood, and Jean's quiet manner and private lifestyle were hampering her growth in her film career. Her wanting to stay behind closed doors didn't sit well with many other actors or directors. But this uniqueness did appeal to one person. Yep, David O. Selznick is still sniffing around. He's now engaged to Irene Mayer, but he's still regularly sending lavish bouquets to Jean, and he put in good words for her in upcoming films. Maybe he didn't want to commit to her 100%, but he did want to help her and make sure that she was successful. For now, at least. Well, it worked. She starred as Clara Bow's little sister in 1929's The Saturday Night Kid, thanks to Selznick's influence. This was huge. Newcomer Jean Harlow also had her very first speaking role in this movie. A huge opportunity, yes, but she still wasn't becoming an overnight superstar with any of her films. She kept plucking away at movies, and then on December 11th, 1930, Jean made her stage debut in the theatrical drama Spring Song, another attempt to strengthen her acting skills. She was scared to death the opening night, but she did it, and she did it great. 1931 marked the end of Jean Arthur's 3-year contract with Paramount, and they decided to let her go at this point. She was very discouraged and ready to give it all up. But then she fell in love. The lucky man this time was the owner of a construction company and sometimes film singer named Frank Ross. The construction company was on the East Coast, so Jean decided to hang up her hat and say goodbye to Hollywood. It was time for a new chapter in her life. It had been 9 years since she'd been in New York City, 9 years since she left for Hollywood with a dream and came back defeated. And it was a different city than the one that she left. The city was filled with brand new towering skyscrapers, including the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. But the people weren't as fortunate as the city landscape. It was 1931, and the city was suffering through the effects of the Great Depression. Jean couldn't get a different job during the Great Depression, so she fell back on acting. She hit the stage and appeared in several Broadway and off-Broadway plays. And then, on June 11th, 1932, Jean married Frank Ross. He was doing very well for himself. Aside from the construction business he owned, he used his family money to purchase many parcels of land on Long Island for a very reduced price. Land he could develop and sell later for a huge profit. Jean stayed busy on the stage and received mostly positive reviews. But she wasn't quite done with the silver screen yet. Her parents were still living in California, and Jean would return to visit them every Christmas season. And while in town, she would take on a movie role. Her 1933 Christmas break movie was for Columbia Pictures, and they liked what she had to offer so much that they offered her a 5-year contract deal. Now she had a huge choice to make. Her new husband was tied down with his business in New York. She loved New York much better than Hollywood. She loved the stage better than the screen. But this opportunity was offering her consistent work and more money than she'd ever made. Ultimately, she decided on Hollywood, and she signed her life over to Columbia Pictures on Valentine's Day, 1934, at the real age of 33, fake age somewhere in the mid to late 20s. She was busy immediately with Columbia. And then came the new genre of movie that would prove to be insanely successful, the screwball comedy, and Jean Arthur was just the girl for the job. Her first screwball comedy gig was in 1935's The Whole Town's Talking, and from there she skyrocketed into a series of screwball comedies, the genre that she helped put on the map. What is a screwball comedy? It is a comedy film that generally has these characteristics: a romantic partnership, generally from different economic backgrounds, entertaining battle of the sexes antics, and a confident female protagonist, and lots of slapstick physical humor. It was a new look on the screen, and audiences loved it. The female leads in screwball comedies were described nicely by author Roger Dooley. He described them as, quote, a new, peculiar American kind of comedienne, the attractive girl who could be funny without losing her feminine charm. Whether debutantes or secretaries, the true 30s heroines were breezy without being brassy, quick-witted but never smart-aleck, capable of meeting the hero on his own terms without putting him down, a breed of heroine never seen before in American films and seldom enough since, end quote. After a long, long climb, Jean Arthur had made it to the top. And then director Frank Capra stumbled upon her, and he was just the kind of guy you wanted to see you. Capra wanted Jean for the female lead opposite Gary Cooper in his screwball comedy, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. He loved her uniqueness and her distinctive voice, even though everyone on the lot called her, quote, cuckoo, simply because she was private and not a carbon copy of everyone else around her. But Columbia lead Harry Cohn wasn't so sure. He was known to be quite a huge jerk. Get a load of what he said about the beautiful Jean Arthur when Frank Capra presented him with the idea. He said, quote, great voice, did you see her face? Half of it's angel and the other half horse, end quote. He went on to say that the left side of her face was nice and feminine, and the right side was masculine and not pretty. So he always made sure the cameraman got her from her good side. Wow, take a peek at Harry Cohn's picture online. He's no Clark Gable. And go and check out the cover image of this episode, and you will see that Jean Arthur is an absolutely beautiful person. Both sides of her. And I can assure you, her inside was way more beautiful than Harry Cohn's. Whatever anyone thought of her, Frank Capra was able to secure her in the role of Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. And that film went on to be nominated for 5 Academy Awards, snagging 1 win for Frank Capra as Best Director, plus it won a New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Film. The film cemented Jean Arthur as Frank Capra's opinion of the finest actress of her day. And the film soared Jean Arthur into international stardom. She had made it. Not only was she now a star, she was a very wealthy star. And just to prove how beautiful she was on the inside, she immediately shared her wealth with her family. She sent her mother on her first trip to Europe, and she bought her father a camper to use on his painting expeditions. She also bought a large home for her parents. She spilled her riches down on her surviving brothers too, and also got her brother Bob a job at the studio. What an angel. Remember now, Jean is married during all of this growth. She and her husband Frank lived apart for 2.5 years as he managed his business and real estate interests out east. But this shot to stardom and new large paycheck for his wife finally made him relocate to California to support her and her finally successful career. The two moved into a mansion in Beverly Hills and bought a glass beach house in Malibu. Sounds amazing. I'm so happy for her. Girl deserved it. Now, what comes with fame and fortune? Media attention. And that was going to be a problem for Jean Arthur. Every journalist wanted to interview her, but Jean was not an open book for them like most other Hollywood stars. And this choice to not provide interviews led to her becoming the most mysterious woman in Hollywood. As quoted in Life magazine in 1940, quote, "Next to Garbo, Jean Arthur is Hollywood's reigning mystery woman," end quote. Columnist Shayla Graham described her as the hardest to understand star in Hollywood. And gossip columnist Luella Parsons, who knew everything about everyone, said that after 30 years of trying, quote, "I really hadn't learned anything about her," end quote. Jean later described how interviews and public appearances made her feel. And the way she described her feelings about it made me feel so much for her, because I feel the same things sometimes. And I can tell you with almost complete certainty that Jean Arthur wasn't strange or cuckoo or rude or mysterious. She was simply an introvert. And she was unique. She didn't fit the mold of the perfect woman. I think she was just a unique introvert. She loved her gardens, her pets, walks on the beach, dips in the ocean, reading amazing books, and just simply being at home. Oh, I feel this in the depths of my soul, Miss Arthur. Jean went on to star in hit after her success in Mr. Deeds, and soon she was known as the Queen of Columbia. Now things get a little spicy for Jean Arthur. She and Harry Cohn were in constant battle over the part she played, what films she was loaned out for, her freedom, pretty much everything. Well, apparently, Jean began telling people that she was plotting to murder Harry Cohn. That's how much she despised the man and his involvement in her career and her life. Okay, maybe that's a little cuckoo. Jean's husband Frank quickly realized his wife needed a little break from Hollywood. We all need a mental health break every now and then, but when it gets to the point of orchestrating a murder plot on your boss, it's really time to step away for a few minutes. Frank and Jean took a little drive out of town, and as they were driving through Carmel by the Sea, a town known to house many people in films and artists and writers, Jean saw a home that she felt was the place that would bring her back to a place of calm. The house was named Driftwood, and Driftwood pulled through on helping Jean find herself again. She also learned how to live for the day, to not fret about yesterday or worry about tomorrow, just focus on today. And learning that skill really helped her in coping with the stresses of her career. Okay, guess what time it is? Time to reference Gone with the Wind. Now, of course, everyone wanted a piece of the action in this movie. Jean's former fling, David O. Selznick, was the producer for the film. He knew they needed the perfect leading lady to play Scarlett O'Hara. He wanted a fresh face, a new star, but that was a huge risk. So in case they didn't find that fresh face, spoiler alert, they did, he had it narrowed down to a list of 5 contenders: Loretta Young, Katharine Hepburn, Paulette Goddard, Doris Jordan, and Jean Arthur. Meanwhile, Vivien Leigh wanted that role of Scarlett O'Hara bad, and she was going to do anything she could to get it. And she got it. And Selznick got his new girl on the scene. 1939 may not have brought Jean Arthur Gone with the Wind, but it did bring her the smash hit Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This film was nominated for a whopping 11 Oscars, just 2 less than Gone with the Wind. Still no nominations for Miss Arthur, though. Jean's husband Frank had gotten into the film business by now, and he'd worked his way up to vice president of Roach Studios pretty quickly. And everyone only had wonderful things to say about him. His kindness, his sense of equality, it sounds like he was a really good man. But just because 2 people are both good people, it doesn't mean a marriage between them can stay good. After about 10 happy years of marriage, Jean and Frank simply began growing apart. They didn't do much to repair it, just let it fade away until there was nothing to repair. They separated in 1942 and stayed legally married for several more years before officially divorcing in 1949. Jean's parents finally divorced in 1942 as well. And then 2 years later, Jean's father passed away. He was the first man she bonded with, the first man she loved, the man she felt the deepest emotional connection to, and the man who crushed her and her future ability to love and trust when he abandoned her. When he had left, he showed her that she was disposable, that she wasn't valuable. Jean Arthur finally got her Best Actress Oscar nod in 1944 for The More the Merrier, but she lost out to Jennifer Jones. Still, though, she had achieved greatness in just being nominated. By the next year, she was backing out of stage performances and declining roles left and right, including the female lead in Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. She was never satisfied with her roles or her performances, even with hits like Mr. Deeds and Mr. Smith. She had wanted deeper, more challenging roles, a struggle all too common for actresses in the Golden Age, but she was rarely given that chance. So she decided to focus her time and energy into something else. She decided to go to college. At age 45, Jean took classes in biology, psychology, philosophy, and sociology. She wanted to give her mind another break from Hollywood, and she wanted to challenge and enrich her mind in new ways. Remember, Jean had been forced to drop out of high school. Well, she had an in at Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri. Here is what Jean later said about this chapter in her life. Quote, "I would be content to spend the rest of my life studying here at Stevens because here I have the opportunity to get the things I have always wanted among such an amazing group of mentally and physically healthy humans. I have worked all my life and have had to be content with philosophies and ideas of my own, and now at last I'm gaining knowledge in an atmosphere where I can get the most and best from my studies." End quote. That doesn't sound like a cuckoo to me. Jean even took a course at Stevens called Marriage and Family, so she could better understand her marriage and why it had failed. Can you imagine the things that were taught in that class in 1946? Well, although Jean had said she could stay in college forever, she was heading back to Hollywood after only 6 weeks. She dipped out right before finals. Hey, if you're not actually working for a degree, that's not a bad idea. So now she was back making movies. It sounds like mostly for the big paychecks that kept coming her way. A Foreign Affair was her first film after a 4-year hiatus from acting, and she would only have 2 more movies after that. Jean kicked off another period of growth in 1948 when she read the book Escape from Freedom by psychoanalyst Henrique Fromm. Listen to this passage from the book and maybe you can understand why. Quote, "The individual ceases to be himself. He adopts entirely the kind of personality offered to him by cultural patterns, and he therefore becomes exactly as all others are and as they expect him to be. The person who gives up his individual self and becomes an automaton identical with millions of other automatons around him need not feel alone and anxious anymore. But the price he pays, however, is high. It is the loss of his self." End quote. Sounds familiar. Well, Jean read this and all of the pieces suddenly started forming together. She went a step beyond just reading Fromm's works. She tracked him down, attended his classes, and began formal psychoanalysis under him. And she considered his therapy life-changing and the most profound period of her life. Jean Arthur's final film was Shane in 1951. She began with Westerns, and she bowed out with a Western, although Shane was a much more dignified Western. Shane was Jean's 89th film. Now, stepping out of the Hollywood scene, Jean did a little traveling abroad, but spent most of her time in her happy place, Driftwood, the home in Carmel by the Sea. This kind of community is the perfect place for someone like Jean Arthur, and her soul was at its most peace here. She found people she actually enjoyed being around and formed a small, tight-knit group of friends. She even met her very first and only best friend there in 1956. She never had a best friend until she was 55 years old. She created a personal space on the grounds and interior of Driftwood that brought her peace and happiness. She was happy. Jean's mother, Hannah, passed away in 1959 at the age of 88. Jean had cared for her for the last couple years of her life and made her as happy and comfortable as she could. Jean was happy in Carmel, but she was also kind of bored. That was remedied in 1964 when Lucille Ball called her and urged her to be on an episode of The Lucy Show. Jean didn't even own a TV. She knew nothing about the medium. She declined, but Lucy urged her to come sit in on a few tapings so she could see what TV was all about. It piqued Jean's interest enough to hire a manager and shop around for other television opportunities. She appeared as a guest on Gunsmoke, and then in the fall of 1966, she dove into her own show, a half-hour comedy called The Jean Arthur Show. Unfortunately, it was a flop and was canceled after 12 episodes. Jean took her disappointment and scurried back to Carmel. Jean had continued to perform on stage here and there over the years. Much too often, she would back out or be unable to perform for several nights in a row. Anxiety, I assume. And then, during a play in 1967, things just went awful. She missed cues and messed up some lines the first night, and then on the second night, she just stopped acting and began talking right to the audience and invited some up on stage and prancing them around to the other actors like they were at a cocktail party. It was a very bizarre incident, and it was followed up by her doctor putting her under strong sedation for fear of a mental break. Jean's next chapter in life was to become an acting teacher at Vassar, even though she herself said that she didn't think acting was something that could be taught. Her students didn't have much good to say about her as a teacher and didn't feel they took away any valuable tools. She taught for 4 years, and the school decided to let her go in 1972. Jean was 71 years old. But she just jumped over into another school. She joined the drama department at the North Carolina School of Arts. She also was not a beloved teacher there and only lasted one school year. Jean wanted to hit the stage one last time, and she did in 1975 in the play First Monday in October. Her performance was not well received, and she missed several performances due to illness. It was a pattern of hers. She realized it was time to step away from acting for good. She wanted nothing more than to live out the rest of her days at Driftwood, but she was running low on money and was forced to sell her home and transition to a smaller, more manageable home. She still had a view of the ocean from her new home in Carmel, though. In May of 1989, 88-year-old Jean Arthur suffered a debilitating stroke, fell, and broke her hip. She suffered with physical and cognitive disabilities and required 24-hour care for her final years. 2 years after her life-altering stroke, 90-year-old Jean Arthur died on June 19, 1991. Eternal peace at her driftwood in the sky. Now I would like to share some other interesting facts about Jean Arthur I learned during my research. Bullet point number 1. If you listened to my Doris Day episode, you know that she also lived in Carmel, and she loved her dogs. When Jean Arthur had to put her home Driftwood up for sale, Doris Day came to look at it. Jean stopped her at the gate and told her the grounds were too delicate for dogs and that it wouldn't be appropriate for her. "This is a house for cats," she told Doris Day. Bullet point number 2. The great Meryl Streep was studying at Vassar when Jean Arthur was teaching there. When Jean saw her perform, she reportedly said, quote, "It's just like watching a movie star." Bullet point number 3. As I mentioned, Jean Arthur exaggerated a bit when it came to her age. She first recorded her birth year as 1905 and then later updated it to 1908. It wasn't until after her death that her real age and birth year of 1900 were discovered. Bullet point number 4. Her most desired roles to play all her life were that of Peter Pan and Joan of Arc, and she was able to play both on the stage. Bullet point number 5. She always advocated for the maltreatment of animals on set and stepped up to help them when needed. Thank you, Jean Arthur. In conclusion, Jean Arthur was a wonderful actress who didn't fit the mold of all the other actresses, and she didn't want to try. She was who she was, and she treaded carefully in her career while protecting her mental health. She experienced a lot of anxieties with life, likely deeply stemming from her constant moving as a child, never knowing what was going to happen next, the fighting between her parents, and the abandonment of her father. She went through a lot of uncertainty and stress as a child, so it's no wonder that she became an adult who had a difficult time coping with life at times and never thought that she was good enough. Jean Arthur maybe wasn't cut out for the traditional life as a celebrity, but she wanted to act, so she did it her way. Jean was a nonconformist, and I think that's pretty damn brave. Thank you, Jean Arthur, for showing us that we should never give up if we know there is something out there that we would be awesome at, especially if it's something that can help others. And thank you all for listening. Please follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and give a 5-star rating and a positive review if you can on your podcast platform. If you want more, check out the bonus content available at patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast. And if you have any recommendations, you can send an email to goldenagestars@gmail.com. My primary source for this episode was a book titled Jean Arthur, The Actress Nobody Knew by John Oler. That book really had everything I need for my research, except the light of my life, IMDB.